evening. It's good to see all of you tonight. If you want to open up to 2 Corinthians chapter 10, that's where our lesson will be tonight. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Before we jump into the text, I want to ask you a couple of questions. Why do you think people are often bolder online, in text messages, or behind a screen than they are face to face? Follow-up question. Say that again. Good. They can be whoever they want to be online. Why do you suppose? Good. There's a sense of safety, a sense of comfort online. Yes. I like that. There's no immediate consequence, or at least physical consequence. Yes. True. Yes, when you're online, you have time to really think and process, or you at least should think before you type and hit send. People don't always do that, but that's a good point. Any other thoughts?
I got a funny one, Tim.
Yes.
The words of Mike Tyson. Everybody's a tough guy until they get punched in the mouth.
There you go. Man, I was kind of nervous when you said Mike Tyson, but you're right. You're absolutely right. Everyone's a tough guy until they get punched in the face. So what changes when the person you're talking about or talking to is standing right in front of you? Okay, you're usually more respectful when you're in person. Bob, what were you saying? Good. So it's easier to solve problems when you're in direct company with someone. There's a deeper connection that is had when we have face-to-face interactions with people. It could be a positive connection, or unfortunately, it could also be a negative connection. I'm reminded of what John wrote in 2 John chapter 1 and verse 12. As John is writing to Christians, he says in verse number 12, if I can turn the page. 2 John verse 12, though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face so that our joy may be complete. Again, in 3 John, verse 13, John writes, I had much to write to you, but I would rather not write with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and we will talk face to face. And so we see that there is a sense of comfort, a sense of safety that is had when we're behind a screen. But as John makes very clear, when we are face to face, there's a deeper connection. In this case, it's a positive experience. But oftentimes, when we have typed something out online and then we see that person in person, it's often very awkward. And so I start class this way to make the point. Tonight, we're going to talk about a man who is accused of exactly this, being bold from a distance, but weak in person. And we'll see why that accusation completely missed the point. And so again, our lesson will begin in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, and we'll see an example of one who was accused of being bold when he was away, but not so confident in person. Before we jump into the text, Dan, could you open us in a word of prayer?
Sure.
Thank you.
Let's bow. Our Heavenly Father, we come before you tonight, thanking you that we can gather together as thy people. Lord, we love you, we glorify you, and we praise your name. Thank you for all the members here and all the people that could be here with us tonight. We know that there are still those without power, without necessity. Pray that you would be with them, that you cover them with your hand. Pray, Lord, that you would bless this hour of study for us, that we would be attentive to thy word, and we would be attentive to the words of the Apostle Paul, and we would learn from the mistakes that the church at Corinth often made. We know that's why these words were written to us there. Lord, be with us, take us through this study, and return us to our home state.
We know that Paul's second recorded letter to the Corinthians was a defense. These Judaizers, or often called super apostles, have called Paul dishonest, cowardly, insincere, greedy, worldly, and even physically weak. And we see here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 that Paul addresses two of these accusations. They called him cowardly. They said that he was bold when he's writing to them, but when he's in their presence, he's physically weak. Paul addresses that accusation, and he also addresses the accusation of worldliness. These super apostles said that Paul was worldly. He walked according to the flesh. And again, that is the second accusation that is addressed in chapter 10. And so, in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse number 1, Paul addresses the first accusation. He says, I, Paul, myself, entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I, who am humble when face to face with you, but bold toward you when I am away. In this passage, we see that Paul begins by speaking sarcastically. He acknowledges or describes himself as the one who is bold when he is away, but humble when face to face. These super apostles, these Judaizers, said that Paul is very harsh in his letters, but when you see him in person, he's not quite the same. He's harsh in his letters, but when you see him in person, he is weak or he is reserved. Do you know anyone who is like this? Do you know someone who writes novels on Facebook threads? They're engaged in some heated argument with someone behind a screen, but then when you see them at church, they're quiet. Or when you see them at work, they don't have a whole lot to say. When you see them at school, they don't have a whole lot to say. But they're very bold on Facebook. Or maybe it's someone who is driving beside you, and you can see that they're very upset with you because you're going too slow or you didn't put your blinker on, and they might do something with their hands that is very offensive. But then both of you pull into the Publix parking lot, and that person is a little bit more reserved. They're a little bit more timid because they didn't think that y'all were in place. They're bold when they're in their vehicle, but when you see them face to face, they are weak. Such a man or such a woman could be called a coward. Here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, these Judaizers are essentially saying that Paul is cowardly. They're saying that he is bold in his letters, but he is humble when he is in front of them. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 10, Paul says, they say of him, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is of no account. And so, the question that we ask ourselves is, was Paul a coward? Is this true? And the answer is obviously not. Paul says that he is humble when he is in their presence because he wants to have a positive experience with these Corinthians. He writes these severe letters so that they will respond favorably to the letter. They'll change their ways. They'll repent of their sins. They'll do good because of what was written in the letter. And then when he arrives to Corinth, they'll have a pleasant, positive experience. We see this in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, again in verses 1 and 2. Paul writes, I, Paul, myself, entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I who am humble when face to face with you, but bold toward you when I am away. Verse 2, I beg of you that when I am present, I may not have to show boldness with such confidence. And so again, he writes these severe letters so that they'll get their act together. And when he is in person, he won't have to rebuke them. They can have a positive experience. We see that here in chapter 10. And we also read about it earlier in chapter 2. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, if you remember, Paul wrote a severe letter. Chapter 2 and verse 1, Paul writes, for I made up my mind not to make another painful visit to you. For if I cause you pain, who is there to make me glad but the one whom I have pained? And I wrote as I did so that when I came, I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice. For I felt sure of all of you that my joy would be the joy of you all. For I wrote to you out of much affliction and anguish of heart and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you. And so again, here in chapter 2, we see the reason that Paul wrote these severe letters, the reason that he was so bold when he was away is so that they would get their act together and he wouldn't have to rebuke them when he was in their physical presence. They could have a positive, encouraging experience. We see it in chapter 10, we see it here in chapter 2, and we also read about it in chapter 12. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, in verse number 20, Paul writes, for I fear that perhaps when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish. I fear when I come, you're going to be in sin. The church is going to be out of control. It's going to be a bad situation. That's my fear. And it is also my fear that I'm going to have to come and rebuke you because of your sin. And so, verse 21, I fear that when I come again, my God may humble me before you, and I may have to mourn over many of those who sinned earlier and have not repented of the impurity, sexual immorality, and sensuality that they have practiced. That's his fear. His fear is coming and the church is out of control. And so chapter 13 and verse number 10, for this reason, we're in chapter 13, verse 10, for this reason, I write these things while I am away from you, that when I come, I may not have to be severe in my use of the authority that the Lord has given me for building up and not for tearing down. And so, again, we see his fear was the church would be out of control. And so that is why he wrote severe letters. That is why he wrote these harsh letters, so that they would turn from their ways and they would have a pleasant experience when they were together in person. Are there any thoughts about what we have just described? Right.
then you may be very harsh about what you've got to say, or otherwise they really may not pay any attention.
Exactly. And we talked about a few weeks ago, and we even talked about it some tonight. When we write, we have more time to really think about what we're going to say. We can be harsh, but we can also be kind in what we say. But sometimes when we're in person and we see that a situation is out of control, we might not have time to really sit back and think about how we're going to respond to that. And our response might be even more harsh than a letter would be. Yes, Dan.
Yeah, we also know that Paul, as you were stating when you first started making this point, we know Paul is not afraid to say it.
Right.
He opposed Peter at Antioch, Galatians 2. And what we know of Peter was a pretty outgoing guy, and you know, certainly from the garden we see he was willing to kind of get into a fight if he needed.
Right.
And even though Paul may not have been big of stature, he still was not afraid to withstand Peter when he was wrong.
Exactly. And that's the next point. We saw how Paul doesn't want to be bold. He doesn't want to be severe and harsh in person, but he can be. He tells these Corinthians, don't get it twisted. I can be harsh. I can be severe. I have the authority to rebuke you if you are out of control. We see that in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Right, he doesn't want to, but he can go there if he needed to. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 8. For even if I boast a little too much of our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for destroying you, I will not be ashamed. I do not want to appear to be frightening you with my letters, for they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech of no account. Let such a person understand that what we say by letter when absent, we do when present. And so if Paul wrote to them and said, if you don't get your act together, if you continue in sin, you'll be purged from the church. If you don't get your act together, if you continue in sin, you'll suffer eternal punishment. If Paul wrote such things in his letters, he says, I will also say those same type of things when I come to you. I can be severe in my pen, and I can also be severe in your presence. We see it here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, and we also read it in chapter 13 in verse number 2. Paul says, I warned those who sinned before and all of the others, and I warn them now while absent, as I did when present on my second visit, that if I come again, I will not spare them. So he wrote, I won't spare you. And he says there was an occasion when he showed up to Corinth and he did not spare them. Paul's point is he can be bold when he is away, and he can also be bold when he is in their presence. All right, any other thoughts about this first section? Yes, that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that out. He does begin this chapter, I, Paul, myself, entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. Meekness is controlled strength. And Jesus was a meek person. He is God in the flesh. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free, as we so often sing. But he didn't, because he was meek. He controlled his strength. And we see that example in Paul as well. Very good thought. Yes. Right. Yes, but there were also occasions when Jesus did show boldness when he was in front of people, flipping over the tables, making a whip, and driving the people out. Yes?
I just wanted to expand on that very thought. I thought that's a very profound thing. Paul is exuding exactly what Christ did, specifically with his apostles and disciples, very much trying to build them up and encourage them because he has the love for them. He feels that they are truly trying to grow. Just as the apostles, Jesus would have to rebuke every once in a while when they did something that was not in line with the way you see the boldness coming out of Christ, certainly, especially when he goes up against the Pharisees and the Sadducees, he's still trying to get them to turn from their ways. It's just
Right.
sharp.
Sure. Sometimes we have to go there with people, and we don't like to, but sometimes it's necessary. Good. So we see the first issue that Paul addresses is the cowardice. They said that he was a coward. He was bold when he was away, but he's weak when he's in person. Paul addresses that issue first. The second issue that he addresses is that of worldliness. They said that Paul is one who walks according to the flesh. In chapter 10 and verse 1, Paul writes, I, Paul, myself entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I who am humble and face to face with you, but bold toward you when I am away. I beg of you that when I am present, I may not have to show boldness with such confidence, as I count on showing against some who suspect us of walking according to the flesh. Earlier, we talked about how Paul can be severe in person. And here in verse 2, we said that he is about to be severe. He is about to be bold toward those who accuse him of walking according to the flesh. These false teachers, these Judaizers, these super apostles have said that Paul is preaching with impure motives. Paul is preaching for pay. Paul is preaching for popularity. He wants clout. He wants to be famous. Paul is dishonest. They say that Paul is walking according to the flesh. But we know this isn't true. Paul addresses that here in chapter 10, and he also addresses it in chapter 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 12, Paul says that he behaved in the world with simplicity and godly sincerity, not by earthly wisdom, but by the grace of God and supremely toward you. Paul's saying that he didn't preach with worldly desires. He's not walking according to the flesh. He behaved in the world with simplicity, godly sincerity, and not with earthly wisdom. Paul is not walking according to the flesh. We see that here in chapter 1, and Paul continues to make the point in chapter 10. In chapter 10 and verse number, though we walk in the flesh, the Christian Standard Bible says, in the flesh. For though we live in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. So they say that Paul is walking according to the flesh. They say that he is preaching with earthly, fleshly, carnal desires. Paul says, no, I minister, I serve, I preach because I am commissioned by God. I've lived with godly simplicity and sincerity. And here in chapter 10, he says that he is not engaged in some type of earthly struggle. He's engaged in a spiritual struggle. Paul is not walking according to the flesh. He's not living according to the flesh. He's walking and living preaching and serving according to the Spirit. He's engaged in a spiritual struggle. We see that here in chapter 10, and Paul also talks to the Ephesians about this spiritual struggle. In Ephesians chapter 6, Paul says in verse 10, "Finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil." Verse 12, "We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." So Paul makes the point to the Ephesians, and he makes the point to the Corinthians here in chapter 10 that he is engaged in a spiritual struggle. He's not preaching, he's not doing anything for fleshly, carnal desires. All right, any thoughts about this section? If the nature of our walk in this life and our ministry is spiritual, how does this change the way that we live? If it's a spiritual struggle that we are engaged in, how should we live? Yes. Okay. We should be more focused on spiritual things instead of physical things. What does that look like practically? Good. Good. Instead of looking at what someone has or doesn't have, look at their heart. Any other thoughts? Good. If we're walking according to the Spirit, then we're not going to be so focused on ourselves. We're going to be focused on other people. And that kind of ties in with what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians we don't regard people according to the flesh. And if we're not looking at people as a fleshly person, but as someone who's going to spend eternity somewhere, then we're going to spend a whole lot of time in this life trying to teach them about Jesus to help them live with him for all eternity. Any other thoughts about this? Right.
So he doesn't even look at a fellow Jew. He doesn't look at a Gentile the way he only regards those who are in Christ as his brothers.
Sure, absolutely. So we see here that Paul makes the point that he's not walking according to the flesh, but he's walking according to the Spirit. And Paul continues to say that he's not walking according to the flesh because he does not compare himself with other people. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul says in verse 12, "Not that we dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves, but when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are without understanding." And so we know that these Judaizers were certainly comparing themselves with other people. They were comparing themselves with Paul. Paul's physical presence is weak, but I'm physically strong. Paul's speech is weak, but I am eloquent. Paul preaches to the Corinthians, but I preach to all of these other people. Paul went to this school, but I went to that school. Paul was trained by this person, but I was trained by that person. They were constantly comparing themselves to him and perhaps other people. But Paul makes the point here in chapter 10 that he is not comparing himself to anyone. Sadly, so many teachers, preachers, and Christians today compare the work that they are doing for the Lord to the work that someone else is doing for the Lord. And that shouldn't be how we live our lives. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse number 18, Paul says, "Let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. For it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends." And so we see in chapter 10 that these Judaizers often compared themselves to other people and they boasted in themselves. Paul says, I'm not walking according to the flesh because I'm not spending my time comparing myself with other people. I serve God and I boast in the Lord. And that's the same attitude that we should have. What are some other areas in life where comparison is tempting? We see it's tempting for Bible teachers and Bible preachers and churches to compare themselves with other preachers and other teachers and other churches. Are there any other areas in life where we see this? Sure. Good. This person has this size house. Look at my house. Or this person has this car, and so I want a better car. They're wearing this. I want to wear that. They went here. I want to go there. Comparison is what? Of joy. The second question is, what usually happens when comparison creeps in? It robs us of joy. It robs us of contentment and peace. Exactly. Very good. And so Paul says, I'm not walking according to the flesh because I don't spend my time comparing myself with other people. I spend my time serving God and boasting in the Lord. Any other thoughts? All right, in the final section, Paul says he's not walking according to the flesh because he stays within his area of influence. He stays in his own lane. Or I'll say it this way, he minds his business. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul writes in verse 13, "But we will not boast beyond limits, but will boast only with regard to the area of influence God assigned to us, to reach even to you. For we are not overextending ourselves as though we did not reach you, for we were the first to come all the way to you with the gospel of Christ. We do not boast beyond limit in the labors of others, but our hope is that as your faith increases, our area of influence among you may be greatly enlarged, so that we may preach the gospel in lands beyond you without boasting of work already done in another's area of influence. Let the one who boasts boast in the Lord, for it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends." And so we see in this section that Paul is making the point. He's been blessed by God with the opportunity to share the gospel with these Corinthians. And he's thankful that many of the Corinthians have obeyed the gospel. And he's hopeful that the Corinthians' faithful lives will inspire someone else to one day obey the gospel. But he's not going to go beyond, or he's not going to boast, as he says, beyond his area of influence. He has been given the task to preach the gospel to the Corinthians. And I interpret this passage as he's not going to meddle in the business of some other preacher who's preaching the gospel somewhere else. He's staying within his area of influence. He's not going to concern himself with the work that someone else is doing in another place. Because ultimately, the work that is being done in Corinth, or the work that is being done in Africa, the work that is being done in Europe, the work that is being done in Australia, I know those continents weren't called that back then, but the point that I'm making is the work that is being done beyond what Paul is doing in Corinth is not the man's work. It's not Cephas' work. It's not Apollos' work. The work that is being done is the work of the Lord. Paul makes that point earlier in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 12. And so if the work being done in Corinth and if the work being done somewhere else is the work of the Lord, then as children of God who are doing the Lord's work, we should be quick to boast in the Lord, as Paul says in chapter 10, verses 17 and 18. What is there to gain from minding our own ministry or minding our own business? I'll ask this question. Does anybody disagree with my interpretation of that passage? Right.
So it's the same principle here that Paul is making essentially.
Yes. And I think it's so sad. We see it so often in the universal churches of Christ. Church A is upset because the church down the street is using their money for whatever reason. Well, if that's what they do, then that's what they do. But we're Church A, and we're led by elders here. And so what Church B down the street is doing really shouldn't be of any concern of ours.
Yeah, but, we also have to be aware and sensitive to things that are happening in church. We're not prepared to deal with things that get introduced.
Sure. Yes, that's a wise comment. Thank you. Any other thoughts on this?
Could distract us from our own spiritual well-being as well.
Yeah?
Stop us from thinking of things that we need to focus on.
Right. If we're so focused on what someone else is doing, then we're not going to have as much time to build this group, this local church up, and be active and busy doing the Lord's work in this area if we're worried about what someone is doing in another area.
And you have that type of focus when you do come into an encounter
Sure. Yes.
It's kind of like argument, but I think the major problem with worrying about everybody else is we're not focused on doing what the Lord wants us to do. And there are things that you can do, and I can do, and others can do, but looking at everybody else and saying, well, why aren't you doing it?
Yeah.
We're not doing the Lord's work. We're just standing there either feeling sorry for ourselves or patting ourselves on the back.
That's a really good point. Yep. All right. Well, I really appreciate you all's comments and your attention. Next week on Sunday, we will consider 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And I'm not sure whether Dan or Colin is teaching. Dan will lead us in a discussion on chapter 11. Thank you.